Abdullah bin Abdulaziz, the cautious modernizer of Saudi Arabia. Part 1. Early Life and Ancestry. Abdullah bin Abdulaziz Al Saud was born on August 1, 1924 in Riyadh, though some sources suggest he may have been born earlier, possibly in 1916 or 1920. His birth occurred at a time when the Arabian Peninsula was undergoing dramatic political transformation, and his father, King Abdulaziz ibn Saud, was still in the midst of his campaign to unify the various tribal regions into what would eventually become the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in 1932. Royal lineage and tribal legacy. Abdullah was the 10th son of King Abdulaziz, the founder of modern Saudi Arabia. His mother, Fahd bint Asi al-Shuraim, belonged to the influential Al-Rashid dynasty, historical rivals of the House of Saud. Fahd's father, Asi bin Shuraim, was the chief of the Shamar tribe, one of the most powerful Bedouin tribes in the region. This lineage gave Abdullah strong tribal credentials and helped him later in life as he sought to maintain relations with the Bedouin and military elite, particularly in the Saudi National Guard, which he would go on to command for decades. However, despite his noble maternal background, Abdullah was not initially seen as a leading contender among the sons of Abdulaziz for succession. His early years were spent largely outside the inner circle of the palace elite, as his mother had died when he was just 6 years old. This loss marked his childhood with a sense of resilience and independence, traits that would define his later leadership. A childhood of discipline and tradition. Unlike some of his half-brothers who received Western-style educations, Abdullah's early upbringing was deeply rooted in Bedouin traditions. His father ensured that he was educated in Islamic studies, tribal customs, and the art of leadership. He learned classical Arabic, studied the Quran, and was trained in traditional Bedouin values, such as honor, generosity, and loyalty. From a young age, he was introduced to horseback riding, falconry, and desert survival skills, a stark contrast to some of his more cosmopolitan half-brothers who were raised in the royal palaces. His close connection with Bedouin culture would later influence his leadership style, as he often sought to maintain strong ties with the tribal factions that formed the backbone of Saudi Arabia's ruling system. Early challenges and overcoming obstacles. As a child, Abdullah reportedly struggled with a speech impediment, which may have contributed to his delayed rise among his royal siblings. His slow ascension was further hindered by the dominance of the Sudari Seven, a powerful bloc of 7 full brothers within the royal family, including Fahd, Sultan, and Nayef. These brothers, all sons of King Abdulaziz and Hassan bin Ahmed al-Sudari, held significant power and were considered the strongest contenders for succession. Despite these challenges, Abdullah worked diligently to earn the respect of his father in the royal court. He distinguished himself by embracing a stoic, principled approach to leadership, often prioritizing tribal diplomacy over palace intrigue. This reputation as a man of the desert would later prove invaluable as he navigated the complex politics of the Saudi monarchy. Gaining his first political experience. By the late 1950s, as his father's health declined and his elder brothers assumed greater responsibilities in government, Abdullah was gradually introduced to public service. His first major appointment came in 1961 when he was made mayor of Mecca, a role that provided him with critical administrative experience in one of Islam's holiest cities. This position, while not the most powerful, helped him gain a deeper understanding of governance and religious affairs, which were central to Saudi rule. His tenure as mayor was relatively short, but it allowed him to forge alliances with clerical leaders, who played an influential role in Saudi politics. His ability to balance religious conservatism with pragmatic governance would later define his approach as king. The early life of King Abdullah was shaped by his tribal heritage, deep connection to Bedouin values, and a gradual but determined rise within the royal family. While he was initially overshadowed by more powerful half-brothers, his resilience, discipline, and commitment to tradition set the foundation for his future leadership. Part 2. Rise to Power. Commander of the National Guard. As Abdullah bin Abdulaziz al Saud entered adulthood, his role within the House of Saud remained uncertain. Unlike some of his half-brothers, who had been groomed from an early age for high-ranking government positions, Abdullah's trajectory was less defined. Yet, through a combination of strategic positioning, personal discipline, and tribal alliances, he steadily ascended the ranks of power. His defining moment came in 1963 when he was appointed commander of the Saudi Arabian National Guard, saying, a position that would shape his political career and cement his authority for decades to come. Building his power base, the National Guard appointment, the Saudi Arabian National Guard, saying, was one of the most critical institutions in the kingdom. Unlike the regular military, which was under the control of the Ministry of Defense, the National Guard was tasked with protecting the royal family, safeguarding the country's internal stability, and countering potential coups or revolts. The origins of Sang could be traced back to the Ikhwan movement, a tribal militia that had helped King Abdulaziz unify the Arabian Peninsula in the early 20th century. After the Ikhwan were crushed in 1929 due to their opposition to modernization, their remnants were gradually absorbed into what would later become the National Guard. Over time, Sang evolved into a highly trained force, but it remained distinct from the Saudi military, functioning as a parallel power structure to ensure the monarchy's security. In August 1963, Abdullah was appointed as the commander of Sang, replacing Prince Saud bin Saud, a son of the former King Saud. His appointment was significant because it gave him control over a loyal, well-trained force that answered directly to him rather than to the Ministry of Defense or the ruling elite dominated by the Sudari brothers. At first, Abdullah's authority over the National Guard was limited. The force was still largely composed of tribal warriors, many of whom were loyal to various factions within the House of Saud. Unlike the regular army, which was being modernized with Western training and equipment, Sang was still reliant on traditional tribal allegiances. Recognizing this, Abdullah sought to modernize and professionalize the force while maintaining its distinct tribal identity. Over the years, he would expand its budget, improve its weaponry, and build an elite officer corps, transforming it into one of Saudi Arabia's most formidable security institutions. Consolidating his influence, tribal alliances, and political maneuvering. While his half-brothers controlled key government ministries, such as defense, foreign affairs, and finance, Abdullah's command of the National Guard allowed him to cultivate a different kind of power. Rather than relying on bureaucratic authority, he forged deep connections with Saudi Arabia's tribal leaders, many of whom provided the backbone of the National Guard's personnel. He traveled extensively across the kingdom, meeting with tribal elders, listening to their grievances, and ensuring that their interests were represented within the government. This strategy earned him a reputation as a leader who understood and respected Saudi Arabia's traditional social fabric. It also gave him a personal power base that was independent of the ruling elite in Riyadh. By the 1970s, Abdullah had cemented his position as a key figure within the royal family. While he was still not considered a primary contender for the throne, his growing influence within Sang made him too powerful to ignore. His biggest test came in 1975, when King Faisal was assassinated by a disgruntled prince. This shocking event led to the ascension of King Khalid, a relatively mild-mannered ruler who was more interested in delegation than direct governance. With Khalid on the throne, the power struggle between the Sudari Seven and the rest of the royal family intensified. In March 1975, just 4 days after King Khalid's accession, Abdullah was promoted to second deputy prime minister, solidifying his place as second in line for the throne after Crown Prince Fahd. However, his appointment sparked internal tensions, as many of the Sudari brothers had hoped that Prince Sultan, another Sudari, would be next in line. This led to a tense standoff within the royal family. The Sudaris attempted to pressure Abdullah into relinquishing control of the National Guard in exchange for his position as second deputy prime minister. They feared that his independent power base posed a long-term threat to their dominance. Abdullah, however, refused to give up control of Sang. He understood that without the National Guard, his political career would be at the mercy of his rivals. His resistance to this pressure led to several heated debates within the royal family, with hundreds of princes involved in discussions about the future of succession. Ultimately, Abdullah prevailed. He kept his position as commander of Sang while also serving as second deputy prime minister, allowing him to maintain his independent influence within the royal power structure. Modernizing the National Guard from a tribal militia to a modern force. Once Abdullah secured his authority, he embarked on an ambitious plan to transform the National Guard. His modernization efforts focused on three key areas: expanding the Guard's size and structure. He increased the number of active duty personnel, bringing in more tribal recruits while also professionalizing the officer corps. Modernizing equipment and training. While the regular Saudi military relied on Western training, Abdullah ensured that Sang received advanced weapons, armored vehicles, and counterinsurgency training. He also formed close ties with the United States, securing military support and cooperation. Cultural and social initiatives. To strengthen the Guard's morale, he promoted Bedouin traditions, including annual tribal festivals like the Janadiria Festival, which celebrated Saudi heritage through folk dances, camel races, and poetry competitions. By the 1980s, the National Guard had become a formidable force, fully loyal to Abdullah. His control over Sang made him one of the most powerful princes in the kingdom, as it provided him with a direct military, political, and tribal support network. Abdullah's appointment as commander of the National Guard in 1963 was the defining moment that set him on the path to eventual kingship. Through careful diplomacy, tribal alliances, and military modernization, he transformed Sang into a political and military powerhouse. His ability to resist pressure from the Sudairi Seven and maintain an independent power base ensured that he would remain a major force within the House of Saud. Part 3. Rise to Crown Prince and de facto ruler, 1982-1995. By the early 1980s, Prince Abdullah bin Abdulaziz had firmly established himself as a key power broker within the Saudi royal family. His long tenure as commander of the National Guard as Sang had allowed him to build an independent base of influence, distinct from the traditional power centers controlled by his half-brothers, particularly the Sudairi Seven. However, his political ascent was still overshadowed by the dominance of Crown Prince Fahd, who held considerable power as First Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Interior. The question of succession loomed large as King Khalid, in failing health, lacked the strong leadership required to navigate Saudi Arabia's complex domestic and international challenges. In 1982, a major shift occurred in the Saudi leadership structure that would propel Abdullah into the highest echelons of power: the death of King Khalid and the accession of Fahd to the throne. This transition marked the beginning of Abdullah's tenure as Crown Prince, a period during which he would increasingly shape the kingdom's policies, particularly after King Fahd suffered a debilitating stroke in 1995, leaving Abdullah as the de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia. The death of King Khalid and the accession of Fahd, 1982. On June 13, 1982, King Khalid passed away, marking the end of an era defined by oil-fueled economic growth and cautious modernization. His successor, Fahd bin Abdulaziz, was widely regarded as a strong Western-leaning ruler who sought to expand Saudi Arabia's global influence. As expected, Fahd immediately appointed his half-brother Abdullah as crown prince, cementing the line of succession. This decision was not without controversy, as some members of the Sudairi Seven had hoped that Prince Sultan, Minister of Defense, would be named Crown Prince instead. However, Fahd recognized that excluding Abdullah, who controlled the National Guard and had strong ties to the kingdom's tribal factions, would risk internal instability. Upon assuming the position of Crown Prince, Abdullah maintained his role as commander of Sang, ensuring that he retained a direct military force loyal to him alone. This dual role gave him significant leverage in Saudi internal politics, positioning him as the most powerful figure in the kingdom after Fahd. Crown Prince Abdullah, balancing reform and conservatism. As Crown Prince, Abdullah adopted a cautious approach to governance, balancing between modernization efforts and the kingdom's deeply conservative traditions. He was seen as a pragmatic leader, someone who sought to gradually introduce reforms while ensuring that the monarchy's legitimacy, rooted in religious authority, remained intact. Some of his notable early initiatives included strengthening the Saudi economy. In response to declining oil prices in the mid-1980s, Abdullah advocated for fiscal prudence and economic diversification, laying the groundwork for future reforms. Expanding military capabilities. He continued modernizing the National Guard, securing billions of dollars in arms deals with Western nations to ensure Saudi Arabia remained militarily strong. Enhancing religious legitimacy. Abdullah positioned himself as a protector of conservative Islamic values. Strengthening ties with the ulama, religious scholars, while also overseeing massive expansions of the holy cities of Mecca and Medina to accommodate millions of Muslim pilgrims. Despite his focus on internal stability, Abdullah was increasingly drawn into foreign policy challenges, particularly the Iran-Iraq War, 1980-1988, and the growing U.S.-Saudi strategic alliance. Saudi Arabia and the Iran-Iraq War, 1980-1988. One of the most significant geopolitical developments during Abdullah's time as Crown Prince was the Iran-Iraq War. The conflict, which erupted in 1980, saw two regional powerhouses, Iran and Iraq, engaged in a brutal 8-year war. Saudi Arabia, fearing the spread of Iran's Islamic Revolution, heavily supported Saddam Hussein's Iraq, providing billions of dollars in financial aid to prevent Iran from gaining dominance in the region. Crown Prince Abdullah played a key role in shaping this policy, working closely with King Fahd to ensure Saudi Arabia remained a dominant force in the Gulf. However, this support for Iraq would later prove controversial, as Saddam Hussein, having survived the war with Iran, would soon turn against his former allies, leading to the next major crisis in Saudi foreign policy, the Gulf War of 1990-1991. The Gulf War and Saudi-U.S. military cooperation, 1990-1991. The invasion of Kuwait by Iraq in August 1990 shocked the Saudi leadership. Saddam Hussein, who had previously relied on Saudi financial backing, had now become the kingdom's greatest threat. Crown Prince Abdullah was initially cautious about allowing foreign troops into Saudi Arabia, fearing that a prolonged American military presence could lead to domestic unrest. However, after consulting with military leaders, Abdullah ultimately supported King Fahd's decision to invite U.S. forces to defend Saudi Arabia. The deployment of over 500,000 U.S. troops into the kingdom marked an unprecedented moment in Saudi history, as it was the first time that such a large-scale foreign military presence had been stationed on Saudi soil. Although the U.S.-led coalition successfully liberated Kuwait in early 1991, the war radicalized certain factions within Saudi society, leading to increased opposition from Islamist groups who viewed the U.S. presence as a violation of Saudi sovereignty. Abdullah, aware of this growing dissent, pushed for a recalibration of Saudi foreign policy, seeking to balance ties with the U.S. while maintaining domestic religious legitimacy. The 1995 stroke of King Fahd, Abdullah becomes de facto ruler. A turning point in Abdullah's career came in 1995, when King Fahd suffered a severe stroke, rendering him largely incapacitated. Though Fahd remained the official monarch, he was no longer able to govern effectively, leaving Crown Prince Abdullah as the de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia. For the next 10 years, Abdullah would run the country's daily affairs, making key decisions on domestic, economic, and foreign policy, while maintaining the illusion of Fahd's continued reign. During this period, Abdullah's leadership was defined by gradual economic reform. He introduced measured changes to stimulate private sector growth and reduce Saudi dependence on oil revenues. Religious appeasement. To prevent Islamist uprisings, he strengthened alliances with conservative clerics while also cracking down on radical elements. Foreign policy pragmatism. He maintained strong ties with the U.S., but also sought to rebuild relations with regional powers such as Iran and Syria. Despite opposition from hardliners within the royal family, Abdullah continued to consolidate his authority, ensuring that when King Fahd finally passed away in 2005, his transition to power would be smooth and uncontested. The years 1982 to 1995 were crucial in shaping Crown Prince Abdullah's leadership style. While initially seen as a secondary figure to King Fahd, his control over the National Guard and strategic decision-making during the Gulf War allowed him to build an independent power base. With King Fahd's 1995 stroke, Abdullah effectively became the ruler of Saudi Arabia, setting the stage for his formal ascension to the throne in 2005. His tenure as de facto leader saw him balance conservative Islamic traditions with economic modernization, a delicate act that would define his reign as king. Part 4, Abdullah's formal accession to the throne, 2005-2015. After a decade of ruling Saudi Arabia in all but name, Crown Prince Abdullah bin Abdulaziz officially became King of Saudi Arabia on August 1, 2005, following the death of King Fahd. His ascension to the throne was widely expected, as he had been the de facto ruler since 1995, when Fahd suffered a debilitating stroke. As King Abdullah inherited a rapidly changing world, marked by economic uncertainty, rising extremism, regional conflicts, and calls for political reform. His reign would be defined by his attempts to modernize Saudi Arabia's economy, cautiously expand social freedoms, and maintain stability during the Arab Spring, all while navigating the complex power struggles within the royal family. Ascending the throne, a smooth transition of power. When King Fahd died in 2005, Abdullah's succession was smooth, as he had already exercised executive control for a decade. His first act as king was to appoint his half-brother Sultan bin Abdulaziz as crown prince, following traditional succession norms within the House of Saud. However, Abdullah was fully aware of the growing challenges facing his kingdom. The country's oil wealth had created economic dependence, while Islamist extremism, fueled by the lingering effects of the 9/11 attacks and the 2003 U.S. invasion of Iraq, was a growing internal threat. Additionally, Saudi youth were demanding more opportunities, and women's rights activists were pushing for change. Determined to balance reform with stability, Abdullah embarked on a cautious but ambitious modernization plan, focusing on economic diversification, education reform, and social progress. Economic reforms, reducing oil dependency and expanding development. One of Abdullah's biggest priorities was reducing Saudi Arabia's over-reliance on oil revenues. Although the kingdom had vast petroleum reserves, the fluctuations in global oil prices created long-term economic risks. To address this, Abdullah pushed for economic diversification. He invested heavily in infrastructure, technology, and manufacturing, encouraging private sector growth beyond oil. Expanded industrial and educational cities. Projects like King Abdullah Economic City, KAEC, were launched to create new hubs of trade and commerce, aiming to attract foreign investment. Increased Saudi participation in the global economy. Under his leadership, Saudi Arabia formally joined the World Trade Organization, WTO, in 2005, signaling its willingness to engage with international markets. Poured billions into education. He believed that investing in human capital was essential, leading to the creation of King Abdullah University of Science and Technology, KAUST, the country's first co-educational research institution. His economic vision was to modernize Saudi Arabia without disrupting its deeply traditional society, a challenge that required both pragmatism and patience. Women's rights, a gradual path toward inclusion. Although Saudi Arabia remained one of the most conservative societies in the world, Abdullah took unprecedented steps to improve women's rights. Key milestones during his reign included appointing women to the Shura Council. In 2013, Abdullah appointed 30 women to the kingdom's Consultative Assembly, Shura Council, marking the first time women held official government positions. Granting women the right to vote and run for office. In 2011, he announced that women would be allowed to vote and participate in municipal elections starting in 2015, a landmark decision. Allowing female athletes to compete in the Olympics. Under international pressure, Saudi Arabia sent female athletes to the 2012 London Olympics for the first time in history. Expanding women's access to higher education and jobs. More women were granted scholarships to study abroad, and female employment opportunities slowly expanded in sectors like retail and healthcare. Despite these reforms, Abdullah faced strong resistance from religious conservatives, and women's rights remained a contentious issue. However, his willingness to challenge the status quo laid the groundwork for future advancements. The Arab Spring, containing the wave of protests, 2011-2013. The biggest political test of Abdullah's reign came in 2011, when the Arab Spring uprising swept across the Middle East and North Africa, toppling long-standing rulers in Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, and Yemen. Fearing that similar unrest could spread to Saudi Arabia, Abdullah took a two-pronged approach. Economic concessions. He announced a $130 billion stimulus package that included higher wages and bonuses for government workers, expanded social welfare programs, housing and job creation initiatives for young Saudis. Strict crackdowns. He swiftly crushed protests, particularly in the Shia-majority Eastern Province, where there were calls for greater political representation and an end to discrimination. Security forces arrested hundreds of activists, sending a clear message that dissent would not be tolerated. Abdullah's strategy prevented mass uprisings in Saudi Arabia, but it also reinforced the kingdom's authoritarian grip on power. While he implemented gradual reforms, he refused to allow political liberalization, fearing that any opening could destabilize the monarchy. Foreign policy, balancing allies and regional power struggles. Abdullah's foreign policy was marked by his pragmatic approach to maintaining Saudi Arabia's influence in the region. Key aspects of his foreign policy included strengthening ties with the U.S. Despite tensions over human rights and the Iraq War, Abdullah maintained a strong military and economic alliance with Washington. He met multiple U.S. presidents, including George W. Bush and Barack Obama, solidifying Saudi Arabia's role as a key regional partner. Countering Iranian influence. He viewed Iran's growing regional power as a major threat, particularly after the 2003 U.S. invasion of Iraq, which destabilized the region. Saudi Arabia supported anti-Iranian forces in Syria, Bahrain, and Yemen, fueling proxy conflicts. Mediating Israeli-Palestinian peace efforts. In 2002, he introduced the Arab Peace Initiative, proposing a two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Although it failed, it demonstrated his willingness to engage in diplomacy. Despite his efforts, Saudi Arabia remained embroiled in regional tensions, particularly with Iran, Syria, and Yemen. The final years in Abdullah's death, 2015. By 2014, Abdullah's health had begun to deteriorate significantly. He had already undergone multiple surgeries, including back procedures in 2010 and 2012. His public appearances became increasingly rare, and power gradually shifted to his successor, Crown Prince Salman bin Abdulaziz. In early January 2015, Abdullah was hospitalized in Riyadh due to pneumonia. Despite medical efforts, he passed away on January 2015 at the age of 90. His funeral was held the same day, following Islamic traditions, and he was buried in an unmarked grave in Riyadh. His successor, King Salman, ascended to the throne, and soon after power shifted to Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, who would implement drastic reforms and consolidate authority in ways that Abdullah had been more cautious about. King Abdullah's reign, 2005 to 2015, was one of stability, cautious reform, and economic modernization. While he introduced historic changes in women's rights and economic policies, he resisted political liberalization, ensuring that the monarchy remained in full control. His leadership protected Saudi Arabia from the chaos of the Arab Spring, but many of his reforms were limited in scope, leaving deeper structural changes for future rulers to address. Part 5. Abdullah's legacy and impact on modern Saudi Arabia. The death of King Abdullah bin Abdulaziz in 2015 marked the end of an era for Saudi Arabia, but his influence did not vanish with his passing. His decade-long reign, combined with the 10 years he spent as de facto ruler before formally ascending the throne, left a deep imprint on the kingdom's political, economic, and social landscape. While Abdullah is often remembered as a reformer who cautiously modernized Saudi Arabia, his legacy is more complex. His policies laid the groundwork for major transformations, yet at the same time, his conservative approach to governance prevented deeper structural change. His impact is still felt today, particularly in the areas of economic modernization, women's rights, religious reform, and Saudi Arabia's shifting role in global affairs. Economic reforms, the foundation for Saudi Vision 2030. One of Abdullah's most enduring legacies is his contribution to Saudi Arabia's economic modernization. Though he did not implement drastic reforms, he introduced policies that diversified the economy and prepared the kingdom for the more ambitious changes that would come under his successor. Key economic policies under Abdullah. King Abdullah Economic City, KAEC. He initiated the development of Saudi Arabia's first megacity, aimed at attracting foreign investment and creating a business-friendly environment independent of oil revenues. World Trade Organization, WTO, membership. In 2005, Saudi Arabia officially joined the WTO, integrating its economy into the global financial system and reducing barriers to foreign investment. Higher education and workforce expansion. Recognizing that economic transformation required a well-educated workforce, he launched the King Abdullah Scholarship Program, which sent hundreds of thousands of Saudi students abroad to study in Western universities. Infrastructure development. He oversaw massive transportation and infrastructure projects, including airports, railways, and industrial zones, which were crucial for Saudi Arabia's long-term economic growth. Laying the groundwork for Saudi Vision 2030. While Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, is credited with launching Vision 2030, many of the seeds of economic reform were planted by Abdullah. His efforts to reduce the country's dependence on oil and modernize its economy created the conditions for MBS to push through more aggressive reforms after 2015. However, Abdullah's gradualist approach meant that many of his economic initiatives lacked full implementation, leaving unfinished projects that would later be revived under Vision 2030. Women's rights laying the foundation for future progress. King Abdullah's reign saw significant, though cautious, advances in women's rights, making him the first Saudi monarch to introduce reforms benefiting women in meaningful ways. Major advancements for women under Abdullah. Women in government. In 2013, he appointed 30 women to the Shura Council, marking the first time in Saudi history that women held official government positions. Voting and electoral rights. In 2011, he announced that women would be allowed to vote and run for office in municipal elections starting in 2015. Education and employment. He expanded higher education opportunities for women, including scholarships for international studies, and encouraged their entry into the workforce, though restrictions remained. The first Saudi female athletes. In 2012, he allowed Saudi Arabia to send female athletes to the Olympics for the first time, despite heavy resistance from religious conservatives. Limits of his reforms. While Abdullah paved the way for later changes, he stopped short of lifting the driving ban on women and did not dismantle the male guardianship system, which continued to limit women's freedoms. His cautious approach ensured that his reforms were not reversed, but they remained incomplete, forcing future leaders to confront the growing demands for greater female empowerment. Religious reforms curbing extremism while maintaining control. King Abdullah walked a fine line between maintaining Saudi Arabia's Islamic identity and reining in the most extreme elements of religious conservatism. His key religious policies. Restricting the power of clerics. In 2010, he decreed that only officially approved religious scholars could issue fatwas, limiting the influence of radical preachers. Promoting interfaith dialogue. He became the first Saudi king to engage in interfaith discussions, meeting with Pope Benedict XIII in 2007 and organizing global religious summits. Cracking down on extremism. Following 9/11 and the rise of Al-Qaeda in Saudi Arabia, Abdullah launched counterterrorism campaigns, arresting thousands of militants and promoting state-controlled religious messaging to counter radical ideologies. Challenges in religious reform. Despite these efforts, Saudi Arabia under Abdullah remained deeply conservative. The Mutawa, religious police, continued to enforce strict social codes, and progressive Islamic voices were largely silenced. However, his efforts to centralize religious authority and curb radical extremism set the stage for more sweeping religious changes under King Salman and MBS. Foreign policy, a complex legacy of regional leadership. Abdullah's foreign policy was pragmatic and cautious, seeking to maintain Saudi Arabia's regional dominance while avoiding direct conflicts. His key foreign policy strategies: strengthening the Saudi-US alliance. Despite tensions over the Iraq War, 2003, and U.S. support for Israel, Abdullah maintained a strong military and economic relationship with Washington. Countering Iranian influence. He saw Iran as Saudi Arabia's greatest threat and supported anti-Iranian forces in Bahrain, Syria, and Yemen, fueling regional proxy wars. Arab Peace Initiative, 2002. He proposed a historic peace deal between Israel and Palestine, offering full recognition of Israel in exchange for a return to pre-1967 borders. The plan was praised internationally but rejected by Israel. Managing the Arab Spring, 2011. He used a mix of financial incentives and harsh crackdowns to prevent protests from spreading to Saudi Arabia, ensuring the monarchy's survival. His influence on Saudi geopolitics. While Abdullah kept Saudi Arabia stable, his indirect involvement in regional conflicts, particularly in Syria and Yemen, would contribute to future instability, leading to the more aggressive foreign policies pursued by MBS. The rise of Mohammed bin Salman and the end of Abdullah's era. Although Abdullah's official successor was King Salman, real power quickly shifted to Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, after 2015. How MBS built on Abdullah's legacy, expanding economic reforms. MBS took Abdullah's economic diversification plans and dramatically accelerated them through Vision 2030. Women's rights. MBS lifted the driving ban and weakened the guardianship system, completing some of Abdullah's unfinished reforms. Religious transformation. MBS restricted the power of the religious police, a move Abdullah had only attempted partially. What was overturned? Crackdowns on royal corruption. MBS arrested dozens of princes, including some of Abdullah's sons, as part of his power consolidation efforts. Foreign policy aggression. Unlike Abdullah's cautious approach, MBS adopted a more interventionist stance, especially in Yemen and Qatar. While Abdullah's vision for Saudi Arabia was gradual and measured, MBS pursued a radical, fast-track transformation, fundamentally altering the kingdom's direction. King Abdullah's legacy is one of cautious modernization, economic reform, and maintaining stability in the face of regional chaos. While he paved the way for future reforms, he was careful not to move too quickly, ensuring that his changes were sustainable. His successor, King Salman, and his de facto heir, MBS, would later accelerate and expand Abdullah's initiatives, sometimes building on them, and other times reversing his policies. Part 6. Abdullah's personal life and influence on Saudi society. While King Abdullah bin Abdulaziz was best known for his role in politics and governance, his personal life and influence on Saudi Arabian society played a crucial role in shaping the nation. As a monarch deeply connected to Bedouin traditions, his leadership was characterized by strong tribal ties, personal humility, and a deep sense of duty to his people. Unlike some of his more Western-leaning half-brothers, Abdullah remained rooted in traditional Saudi values, favoring tribal diplomacy, religious legitimacy, and social conservatism. At the same time, he also demonstrated a deep concern for the welfare of ordinary Saudis, making efforts to modernize education, improve healthcare, and develop infrastructure. This part of the biography explores his family background, personal beliefs, lifestyle, and his contributions to Saudi society outside of politics. A devout and traditional leader, ties to Bedouin heritage. Unlike many of his royal half-brothers who were raised in urban palaces, Abdullah spent much of his early life among the Bedouin, learning tribal customs, horseback riding, falconry, and survival in the desert. This experience gave him a strong connection to Saudi Arabia's traditional way of life, which influenced his leadership style and decision-making. He was known for his simple lifestyle, often retreating to the desert for reflection and hunting trips. He maintained close relationships with tribal leaders, strengthening his legitimacy outside the elite circles of Riyadh. His love for horses and camels was well documented, and he invested in equestrian sports and breeding programs. Even as king, Abdullah continued to embrace his Bedouin heritage, making sure that his policies reflected the needs and values of Saudi Arabia's tribal communities. Religious beliefs and relationship with the clergy. As a deeply religious man, King Abdullah placed great importance on maintaining Saudi Arabia's Islamic identity. He was a devout Sunni Muslim, known for performing prayers regularly and observing religious rituals. Despite his conservative religious views, he was also pragmatic, understanding the need for modernization and controlled reform. He sought a careful balance between religious authorities, the ulama, and government control, ensuring that the monarchy remained the dominant force in Saudi politics. While he maintained good relations with religious clerics, he curbed their influence when necessary, especially when they opposed his economic and social reforms. Marriage and family life. Like many Saudi monarchs, King Abdullah had multiple wives and numerous children. His marriages were often arranged for political and tribal alliances, strengthening ties between the House of Saud and influential clans. Notable aspects of his family life. Abdullah reportedly had up to 30 wives, though the exact number is uncertain. He fathered at least 36 children, many of whom hold important governmental and business positions. His children were raised with a mix of traditional Saudi values and modern education, with some receiving Western schooling abroad. His daughter, Princess Adila bint Abdullah, became an outspoken advocate for women's rights, a rarity in Saudi royal circles. Despite his large family, Abdullah was known for his humble and caring nature, often spending private time with his children and grandchildren. Lifestyle and personal interests. Love for horses and equestrian sports. He founded the King Abdullah Equestrian Club, which became a center for horse racing and breeding programs. He frequently attended equestrian events and personally gifted prized horses to foreign dignitaries. King Abdullah was one of the most passionate horse enthusiasts in Saudi Arabia. His stables housed over 1,000 horses, and he personally oversaw the breeding of Arabian thoroughbreds. His passion for horses reflected his Bedouin heritage, where horseback riding symbolized strength and nobility. Hunting and falconry. Abdullah was also an avid falconer, a tradition deeply rooted in Arabian and Bedouin culture. He would often spend time in the desert, hunting with falcons and participating in traditional Bedouin hunts. This love for nature and wildlife conservation led him to support environmental preservation efforts, particularly in protecting desert species such as the Arabian oryx and falcons. Contributions to education and cultural development. While Abdullah was often viewed as a conservative ruler, he valued education and intellectual progress. He believed that a strong education system was essential for Saudi Arabia's future, leading him to invest heavily in higher education and research. Key educational initiatives. King Abdullah Scholarship Program, 2005. One of his most significant legacies, this program funded over 150,000 Saudi students to study abroad, particularly in the US, UK, or in Europe. It was aimed at expanding Saudi Arabia's knowledge economy and reducing dependence on oil. King Abdullah University of Science and Technology, KAUST, 2009, a world-class research institution that became the first coeducational university in Saudi Arabia. It promoted scientific research and technological innovation, breaking traditional barriers in Saudi academia. Public education reform. He modernized school curricula, integrating science, technology, and critical thinking alongside religious studies. Female education was expanded, allowing women greater access to academic opportunities. His commitment to education demonstrated a vision for a progressive Saudi Arabia, even though cultural and political constraints prevented more rapid reform. Healthcare and social welfare initiatives. Abdullah placed a strong emphasis on healthcare and public welfare, particularly for low-income Saudis. He expanded medical facilities and built specialized hospitals, including King Abdullah Medical City in Riyadh. He improved public housing programs, ensuring that poorer families had access to government-supported housing. His government subsidized essential goods and services, including food, fuel, and healthcare to protect citizens from economic hardships. Despite his efforts, Saudi Arabia's welfare system still struggled with inefficiencies and bureaucratic corruption, challenges that persisted after his reign. Philanthropy and humanitarian efforts. King Abdullah was widely recognized for his charitable contributions both in Saudi Arabia and internationally. He donated $10 billion to the endowment fund of King Abdullah University of Science and Technology, KAUST. He funded hospitals, orphanages, and relief programs in Palestine, Syria, Pakistan, and Africa. In 2008, he contributed $50 million in cash and $10 million worth of aid for victims of the Sichuan earthquake in China. He established the King Abdullah International Foundation for Charity and Humanitarian Work, which supported global disaster relief. His philanthropic activities helped shape his reputation as a leader who cared for the welfare of Muslims worldwide. King Abdullah's personal life reflected his deep connection to Saudi traditions, Bedouin values, and Islamic heritage. While he was a conservative leader, he also understood the importance of education, modernization, and social welfare in Saudi Arabia's future. His investments in education, healthcare, and cultural development had long-term effects, influencing many of the reforms implemented under King Salman and Mohammed bin Salman, MBS. However, his gradualist approach meant that many of his initiatives remained incomplete, requiring future leaders to either expand upon or drastically alter his vision. Part 7. Abdullah's relationship with the royal family and power struggles. While King Abdullah bin Abdulaziz was widely respected for his leadership, his rise to power was not without challenges. The House of Saud, one of the largest and most complex royal families in the world, was often plagued by rivalries, factionalism, and power struggles. As one of King Abdulaziz's many sons, Abdullah had to navigate internal conflicts within the family, particularly with the Sudairi Seven, a powerful bloc of full brothers led by King Fahd, Crown Prince Sultan, and Prince Naif. His political survival depended on careful maneuvering, strategic alliances, and the strength of his independent power base in the Saudi National Guard. This part of the biography explores Abdullah's complicated relationships within the royal family, his rise to power despite opposition, and how he secured his authority as king. The House of Saud, a dynasty of many princes. The Saudi royal family is one of the most extensive ruling families in the world, with thousands of princes and princesses. The family's leadership has traditionally been passed among the sons of King Abdulaziz, the founder of modern Saudi Arabia. However, succession has not always been smooth, with rivalries between different factions shaping the kingdom's politics. The two main power factions in the royal family, the Sudairi Seven, a powerful group of 7 full brothers, all sons of King Abdulaziz and Hassa bin Ahmed al-Sudairi. This group included King Fahd, reigned 1982-2005, Crown Prince Sultan, Minister of Defense, Prince Naif, Minister of Interior, Prince Salman, later king, Prince Ahmed, Prince Abdulrahman, and Prince Turki. The Sudairi brothers controlled many of the key ministries, particularly defense, security, and intelligence. They worked as a cohesive unit, supporting each other's ambitions and policies. The other sons of Abdulaziz. This group consisted of the other royal half-brothers, including Abdullah, who had a different mother. These princes often had to compete for influence against the powerful Sudairi faction. Abdullah represented the independent princes, who were not part of the Sudairi network. His main strength came from his control of the Saudi National Guard, which served as a counterbalance to the regular military controlled by the Sudairis. Abdullah versus the Sudairi Seven, a struggle for power, marginalized in his early years. For much of his early life, Abdullah was overshadowed by the Sudairi Seven. King Faisal, 1964-1975, favored the Sudairi brothers for key government roles, leaving Abdullah with limited influence. King Khalid, 1975-1982, though not a Sudairi, relied heavily on Crown Prince Fahd, giving the Sudairi faction even greater power. Prince Sultan was Minister of Defense, and Prince Naif was Minister of Interior, controlling both the military and security forces. Abdullah's only real power base was the Saudi National Guard, which was loyal to him personally. However, the Sudaris constantly pressured him to relinquish control of Sang, fearing that it gave him too much independence. The 1977 succession crisis. One of the first major power struggles involving Abdullah occurred in 1977, when discussions began over who would be second in line to the throne after King Khalid and Crown Prince Fahd. The Sudaris wanted Prince Sultan to be named the next crown prince. Abdullah, as the most senior non-Sudari prince, was also a strong contender. Hundreds of Saudi princes gathered to debate the issue, with intense disagreements over whether Abdullah should be removed from the line of succession. In the end, King Khalid refused to side completely with the Sudaris, and Abdullah was confirmed as second deputy prime minister in 1975, effectively making him the second in line to the throne. This event was a major victory for Abdullah, as it ensured that he would eventually become crown prince, despite Sudari opposition. De facto ruler after King Fahd's stroke, 1995-2005. When King Fahd suffered a stroke in 1995, he became incapacitated, and Crown Prince Abdullah assumed the role of de facto ruler. However, the Sudari brothers, particularly Prince Sultan and Prince Nayef, resisted Abdullah's full control. They attempted to undermine his authority, claiming that Fahd was still capable of making key decisions. Abdullah had to constantly negotiate with the Sudaris, ensuring that they did not block his policies. Tensions ran high as Abdullah sought to assert his leadership without sparking a full-scale power struggle. Despite their opposition, Abdullah's control over the National Guard and his alliance with other royal factions allowed him to secure his position. Succession of 2005, becoming king and dealing with rival princes. Appointing Crown Prince Sultan. When King Fahd died in 2005, Abdullah officially ascended the throne. However, to maintain stability, he appointed his rival, Prince Sultan, as crown prince. This move reassured the Sudari faction that they still held influence, prevented an immediate succession crisis, allowed Abdullah to consolidate his authority gradually. However, Sultan's death in 2011 and Nayef's death in 2012 forced Abdullah to appoint Salman as crown prince, further strengthening the Sudari faction. The Allegiance Council, Abdullah's strategy to prevent Sudari dominance. In 2006, Abdullah took a bold step to reduce the Sudari grip on succession by establishing the Allegiance Council, a committee of senior princes tasked with deciding future successions through a secret ballot. This was a significant shift from the traditional direct appointment system, which had often favored the Sudaris. The council was meant to prevent any single faction, especially the Sudaris, from monopolizing the throne, ensure a more inclusive decision-making process among royal family members, avoid succession crises by creating a clear, agreed-upon system. However, after Abdullah's death in 2015, King Salman weakened the Allegiance Council's role, eventually sidelining it in favor of his son, Mohammed bin Salman, MBS. Power struggles after Abdullah's death. 2015. Despite Abdullah's efforts to reduce Sudari dominance, after his death in 2015, the royal power dynamics shifted dramatically under King Salman. Salman quickly appointed Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, as crown prince, bypassing the older generation of princes. Many of Abdullah's sons and close allies were sidelined or arrested during MBS's power consolidation. The Allegiance Council lost much of its influence, and decision-making became centered around Salman and MBS. This represented a major reversal of Abdullah's efforts, as the Sudari faction reasserted itself under King Salman's leadership. King Abdullah's relationship with his royal brothers was marked by rivalry, negotiation, and strategic maneuvering. His biggest challenge was the dominance of the Sudari Seven, who controlled many of the kingdom's key ministries. Despite these obstacles, he secured his rule, introduced the Allegiance Council, and prevented a complete Sudari takeover. However, after his death, the rise of King Salman and MBS reversed many of his efforts, leading to a new phase of centralized power in the kingdom. Part 8. Abdullah's role in regional conflicts and Middle Eastern politics. As one of the most influential leaders in the Middle East, King Abdullah bin Abdulaziz played a crucial role in shaping regional politics and handling major crises. His foreign policy was defined by pragmatism, alliance building, and the balancing of regional rivalries. During his reign, the Middle East faced some of its most significant conflicts, including the U.S. invasion of Iraq, the rise of Iran's influence, the Syrian civil war, the Yemeni conflict, and the Arab Spring uprisings. Abdullah sought to protect Saudi Arabia's regional leadership while also ensuring that internal stability was not threatened by external turmoil. This part of the biography explores Abdullah's foreign policy decisions, his approach to key regional conflicts, and the impact of his leadership on Middle Eastern geopolitics. Saudi-U.S. relations, a complex but strong partnership. Saudi Arabia's relationship with the United States was one of King Abdullah's most significant foreign policy concerns. While he valued the economic, military, and diplomatic alliance, he also clashed with U.S. policies on several occasions, particularly concerning Israel, Iran, and Iraq. Key aspects of Abdullah's U.S. policy: strong military cooperation. He continued to purchase billions of dollars worth of U.S. weapons, ensuring Saudi Arabia remained militarily strong. Concerns over U.S. actions in Iraq, 2003. He opposed the U.S. invasion of Iraq, fearing it would destabilize the region and strengthen Iranian influence. Tensions over Israel and Palestine. He was frustrated with U.S. support for Israel, leading him to reject a 2001 invitation to Washington in protest. War on terror cooperation. He worked closely with U.S. intelligence agencies to combat al-Qaeda after the 9/11 attacks, which had strained U.S.-Saudi relations due to the involvement of Saudi nationals in the attack. Despite disagreements, Abdullah remained a key ally of the U.S., ensuring that Saudi Arabia retained a powerful global position. The Iraq War and its aftermath, 2003-2011. The 2003 U.S.-led invasion of Iraq was one of the most significant foreign policy challenges of Abdullah's career. Saudi Arabia's stance on the Iraq War. Abdullah privately warned the Bush administration against invading Iraq, fearing it would lead to sectarian chaos and Iranian dominance. After the fall of Saddam Hussein, he refused to send Saudi troops to support the U.S. occupation, though he allowed logistical U.S. military operations to continue in Saudi territory. He was deeply suspicious of Iraq's new government, believing it was too close to Iran. The rise of Iran's influence in Iraq. Abdullah's fears about Iran's expansion proved correct. After Saddam's fall, Iraq's new Shia-led government formed strong ties with Tehran, leading to growing Sunni-Shia tensions across the Middle East. Saudi funding of Sunni militias in Iraq to counter Iranian-backed groups. A long-term rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iraq's new leadership, which continued even after Abdullah's death. Despite these tensions, Saudi Arabia later re-engaged diplomatically with Iraq, recognizing that it could not afford to completely alienate Baghdad. The Arab Spring, 2011, supporting stability over democracy. The Arab Spring uprisings of 2011 were a major challenge for Abdullah. As protests erupted across the Middle East, several long-standing Arab leaders were overthrown, including Zine El Abidine Ben Ali, Tunisia; Hosni Mubarak, Egypt; Muammar Gaddafi, Libya; Ali Abdullah Saleh, Yemen. Abdullah's response was to prioritize stability over democracy, fearing that regime changes would weaken Saudi Arabia's regional influence. Saudi Arabia's response to the Arab Spring. Economic concessions. To prevent unrest, Abdullah announced a $130 billion stimulus package, increasing wages, subsidies, and social benefits for Saudis. Military intervention in Bahrain. He sent 1,200 Saudi troops to crush protests in Bahrain, ensuring that a Shia-led uprising did not succeed. Backing Egypt's military coup. 2013, Abdullah opposed the Muslim Brotherhood and supported General Abdel Fattah el-Sisi's coup, restoring military rule in Egypt. Crackdown on Saudi protesters. In Saudi Arabia's Shia-majority eastern province, protests were violently suppressed, with hundreds arrested. While his strategy protected Saudi Arabia from unrest, it also increased tensions with reformist and opposition groups. The Syrian Civil War, 2011-2015. When the Syrian Civil War began in 2011, Abdullah saw it as an opportunity to weaken Iran's ally, Bashar al-Assad. Saudi Arabia's role in Syria. Abdullah funded and armed Syrian rebel groups, hoping to overthrow Assad. He supported Sunni Islamist factions fighting against the Syrian government. Saudi Arabia worked with Turkey, Qatar, and Western allies to weaken Assad's regime. However, his strategy backfired when the rebellion became fragmented, leading to the rise of extremist groups like ISIS, which Saudi Arabia later had to fight against. A prolonged civil war with no clear victory, as Assad's regime survived with Iranian and Russian support. Although Abdullah opposed direct Saudi military involvement, his policies deepened Saudi-Iranian tensions in the region. The Yemen conflict and the Houthi uprising, 2009-2015. Yemen had long been a concern for Saudi Arabia, given its bordering location and history of political instability. Abdullah's key actions in Yemen. In 2009, he launched a military campaign against the Houthi rebels, who were Iran-backed Shia militants fighting Yemen's government. He provided financial and military aid to Yemen's government to suppress opposition forces. After President Ali Abdullah Saleh was forced out in 2012, Abdullah supported the new Saudi-friendly government. Despite his efforts, the Houthis remained a strong force, and after Abdullah's death, the conflict escalated into full-scale war under King Salman. Relations with Iran. A Cold War in the Middle East. Saudi Arabia's biggest geopolitical rival under Abdullah was Iran. He saw the Iranian regime as a threat to both Saudi security and Sunni dominance in the region. Key Saudi-Iranian clashes under Abdullah. Iraq, 2003-2011. After Saddam's fall, Iran gained major influence in Iraq, leading Saudi Arabia to support Sunni factions in opposition. Lebanon, 2005-2015. Saudi Arabia backed Sunni and Christian politicians against Iran-backed Hezbollah. Syria, 2011-2015. Saudi Arabia supported Sunni rebels, while Iran supported Bashar al-Assad. Yemen, 2009-2015. Saudi Arabia tried to eliminate the Iran-backed Houthi movement, leading to a long-term proxy war. Despite these conflicts, Abdullah occasionally sought diplomatic openings with Iran, particularly during Mahmoud Ahmadinejad's presidency, though tensions remained high. King Abdullah's foreign policy was defined by pragmatism, strategic alliances, and efforts to counter Iran's regional influence. While he strengthened Saudi Arabia's global position, his interventions in Iraq, Syria, and Yemen contributed to prolonged regional conflicts. His support for stability over democracy during the Arab Spring ensured Saudi Arabia's survival, but strained its relations with reformist movements. Part 9. Abdullah's death, succession, and historical legacy. After a long and influential reign, King Abdullah bin Abdulaziz Al Saud passed away on January 23, 2015, at the age of 90. His death marked the end of an era in Saudi history, as he was one of the last rulers from the generation of King Abdulaziz's sons who had shaped modern Saudi Arabia. His leadership left a lasting impact on Saudi governance, economic policy, social development, and regional politics. However, the transition after his death shifted the balance of power, with King Salman and Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, consolidating control, reversing some of Abdullah's policies while expanding others. This final part examines Abdullah's last years, his death, the succession process, and his enduring legacy in Saudi Arabia and the world. Abdullah's final years, ailing health and power shifts. By 2010, Abdullah's health had begun to deteriorate significantly. He suffered from chronic back pain, requiring multiple surgeries. His medical issues forced him to reduce his public appearances, and by 2014, he was seen connected to breathing tubes during meetings with U.S. diplomats, signaling severe health complications. Key health issues in his final years. In November 2010, he was hospitalized for a herniated disc and a blood clot affecting his spine. He underwent 2 surgeries in New York, followed by another operation in 2012 in Riyadh. By late 2014, reports suggested that his ability to govern was limited, with Crown Prince Salman bin Abdulaziz handling more state affairs. Despite his declining health, Abdullah continued to implement policies particularly in economic reform and military modernization. However, the final year of his reign saw power gradually shifting to King Salman and his son, Mohammed bin Salman. The death of King Abdullah and national mourning, January 2015. On January 2, 2015, Abdullah was admitted to the King Abdulaziz Medical City in Riyadh with a lung infection. His condition worsened over the next 3 weeks, and on January 23, 2015, he was pronounced dead at the age of 90. Reactions to his death. Saudi Arabia declared a 3-day national mourning period, though no public holiday was given, in keeping with Saudi traditions. Leaders from around the world, including U.S. President Barack Obama, British Prime Minister David Cameron, and Russian President Vladimir Putin, expressed condolences. Flags were flown at half-mast in several countries, including the UK, India, and Pakistan, a rare honor for a Saudi king. World leaders praised his contributions to economic modernization, regional stability, and interfaith dialogue. The succession. King Salman takes power. Upon Abdullah's death, his half-brother Salman bin Abdulaziz, who was crown prince, was immediately declared king of Saudi Arabia. Abdullah's planned succession versus Salman's rapid changes. Before his death, Abdullah had established the Allegiance Council to ensure a smooth, consensus-driven succession process, appointed Prince Mukran as crown prince, ensuring that a non-Sudairi remained in the line of succession, sought to limit Sudairi dominance in Saudi governance. However, after Salman took power, Prince Mukran was removed as crown prince within 3 months. Prince Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, was rapidly promoted, bypassing older princes. Many of Abdullah's loyalists were sidelined, signaling a new era in Saudi leadership. While Abdullah had worked to balance power among different royal factions, King Salman and MBS quickly centralized power, undoing much of his political maneuvering. Abdullah's enduring legacy. Despite political changes after his death, Abdullah left a lasting mark on Saudi Arabia in multiple areas. 1. Economic modernization. His policies helped diversify the economy, preparing the groundwork for Vision 2030, expanded under MBS. He improved global investment ties, bringing Saudi Arabia into the World Trade Organization, WTO. The King Abdullah Economic City, KAEC, was one of his signature projects designed to expand industrial growth beyond oil. 2. Education and social reforms. The King Abdullah Scholarship Program allowed hundreds of thousands of Saudis to study abroad, shaping a more globally aware workforce. He expanded women's rights, allowing them to vote and run for office in municipal elections. He established King Abdullah University of Science and Technology, KAUST, the first co-ed university in Saudi Arabia. 3. Foreign policy and regional conflicts. He positioned Saudi Arabia as a regional leader, engaging in Syrian, Yemeni, and Iraqi conflicts to counter Iran. His 2002 Arab Peace Initiative remains the only comprehensive Saudi-led peace plan for Israel-Palestine. His firm opposition to the Muslim Brotherhood in Iran shaped Saudi geopolitical strategies for years after his death. Abdullah versus his successors. Contrasts in leadership. While Abdullah was a cautious, consensus-driven leader, his successors, particularly Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, took a more radical approach to reform and power consolidation. While Abdullah paved the way for reforms, Salman and MBS accelerated them, sometimes building on his legacy and sometimes reversing his political strategies. Conclusion: how history remembers King Abdullah. Positive legacy. 1. A reformer within limits. He balanced modernization with tradition, making measured progress on economic and social fronts. 2. Preserved Saudi stability. His rule protected the kingdom from the chaos of the Arab Spring. 3. Promoted education and women's rights. Though limited, his efforts paved the way for later reforms. 4. Maintained strong international ties. He ensured Saudi Arabia remained a global power, despite tensions with the U.S. Criticism and controversies. 1. Limited political reforms. He refused to allow political liberalization, ensuring Saudi Arabia remained an absolute monarchy. 2. The harsh crackdowns on dissent. He suppressed protests, particularly in Shia-majority regions. 3. Involvement in regional conflicts. His funding of Syrian rebels and intervention in Yemen contributed to ongoing instability. Final thoughts. The king who bridged tradition and change. King Abdullah's reign was a bridge between Saudi Arabia's past and its future. He was not a revolutionary reformer, but he laid the foundation for economic and social change. He protected Saudi Arabia's stability, but at the cost of political freedoms. His foreign policy was pragmatic, but it deepened sectarian divisions in the Middle East. Ultimately, his greatest legacy was ensuring that Saudi Arabia remained strong, stable, and influential in a rapidly changing world.